as should now be evident, there certainly appears to be some sort of gendered effect when it comes to experiences in the criminal justice process. The question is, right, why is that the case? Well, first, some argue it simply isn't. It has been argued that really men and women are treated the same in the system. This is the equal treatment hypothesis. However, to be sure, this is inconsistent with most observations of how gender operates throughout the criminal justice system. So this has been generally, I don't want to say dismissed, but debunked would probably be the best way to say. There's been extensive research that looks at gender at all the various levels of the criminal justice process, and there certainly seems to be some sort of relationship between gender and the outcomes of that experience. But before we go further, let's first discuss what is sexism. Hopefully we've kind of clarified what this means, but because of the nature of this conversation, it's critical that we have a good definition, okay? Sexism refers to any sort of discrimination against a person based on their sex or gender. This is connected to stereotypes and expectations about gender roles, right? So if you expect women to behave a certain way, then you will treat them as such, and that is a form of discrimination or prejudice. And the same is true for men. This projects assumptions, right? This projects my own assumptions about you and your behavior onto you. And that can be really restricting, right? If, for example, let's say you thought that all men were incompetent and arrogant. Well, then maybe you wouldn't ever give them the opportunity to be in a leadership position because you thought that they wouldn't be good at it and you thought that they would be miserable to work at, right? So instead, this limits their ability to succeed in that environment. And this is true in in all various realms of life, right? It's not just in the workplace. But there's various forms of sexism, to be sure, right? So typically what we think of is known as hostile sexism. So what I just described is hostile sexism, this treating somebody negatively based on assumptions about who they are as a person because of their sex, right? This is notably distinct from benevolent sexism. Benevolent sexism is much more subtle, and it's generally subjectively seen as positive, right? So if I'm the person that is acting benevolently sexist, right, I'm like, well, why are you complaining? I'm saying good things. Okay, so what this is when I make assumptions, or any person makes assumptions about someone based on their sex, but I say, well, it's okay because they're good things, right? So, oh, well, you'll be a good mother, you're a woman, right? So although that's a seemingly positive assumption to make about a person, it's still an assumption nevertheless, and it's based on their likelihood, or based on your understanding of gender roles and gender expectations. Right, and so as I noted, it's subjectively positive, right? So while for some people saying that, oh, well, I'm sure you'll be a good mom, you're a woman, might be a nice thing to hear. But for other people, they may not want to be a mom, and so they feel confined by that sort of assumption about that person. Okay, and it perpetuates the notion that women need men's protection, right? So this is so if you ever see people complain about somebody holding the door for them, okay, this is a very minor example, but right, if somebody holds the door for you and you're like, well, I can get it myself, I don't need you to do it, right? Well, if they just assume that a man just assumed a woman needed the door held for her, right? Well, it's just, it's a nice thing that you do, right? But it perpetuates this idea that men take care of women, and that begs the question then, who's taking care of men? Okay, now to be sure, I live in the South. I think it's great. Manners are great. I hold the door for everyone, and I think everyone should do the same. But I don't think that should be defined or determined based on my sex or that of the other people or gender of the people that I'm interacting with. Okay, so one of the first attempts to describe or understand the gender gap in offending, and more so the differences in the criminal justice system as we see, right? Because we look at the prison population and it is overwhelmingly male, and it has been for all of time. So one of the first attempts to explain that was in 1950. So this is old, okay? So have that in mind. But he raises some interesting points, okay? So Otto Pollack he wrote a book called The Vast Criminality of Women. But for him, he said, women are committing just as much crime as men. it's not that they aren't doing it, it's that they're not getting caught. Okay, their role as a homemaker gives them access to engage in certain crimes, right? So they're likely committing child abuse or abusing the elderly or stealing from their husband, right? Whatever it might be. Now again, remember it's 1950s, okay? But right, for Pollock, the gender gap isn't really in crime. It's not men and women committing significantly different levels of crime. It's rather their ability to hide that or to mask it, as he calls it. Okay, so he says that female criminality is masked in 3 ways. Okay, so it's that offenses committed by women are underreported. And this is consistent with some of what we've talked about this semester, right? That men who are victims of, in particular, of sexual violence at the hands of a woman are significantly less likely to report, right? Gender roles say that men should want any sexual advances from women, and B, that women aren't going to behave that way, and women aren't going to be violent, let alone sexually violent. So men fear being believed, or not being believed, or being made fun of, or being belittled, very much so in the circumstances where there's a female offender. So it's likely, for Pollock, that these sorts of offenses aren't getting reported. Okay, the second reason is that female offenders just aren't detected as much, right? And this is, if you think about some of what we talked about with drug trafficking, right? So that women are normally relegated to lower levels in the trafficking network, right? So they're normally mules of sorts, so they're transferring drugs across the border. And why are they doing that? Because they're less likely to be identified. People are less likely to be suspicious of them. A really good example I think of when I like to think of when I in this context is one time I was at Lowe's and I had a few things in my hand. I had like a $30 or $40 can of something that my husband needed. And he called me and was like, oh, hey, I found it. I don't need you to get it, but come home. I need your help quick. So I like threw everything down in my arm like that I had in my hands and I walked out the store. Well, I carried a soda under my arm, like in my arm, in between my arm and my body a lot, sometimes if my hands are full. And so I don't think about that, right? I'll put things there and I won't think about what's there. Well, I had a can, like a $30 can of something in my arm. And I didn't even realize it because I had my cell phone in the other hand and, I was just walking out and I walked right out. I got all the way to my car and I was like, wait, what am I doing with this? And I turned around and I went back in and I was like, I don't need this, whatever. But there was a security guard at the door when I walked out who said goodbye to me. And that was there when I walked back in, still with the item in my hand. And he didn't look twice, right? So there could be so many reasons why that's the case, but it illustrates this idea of women are often just overlooked. If we make assumptions, right, think benevolent sexism here. If we make assumptions that women are not going to behave violently or that women are not going to behave criminally at that, then we're not going to be looking for them to do so. And so it's easier for them to get away with it. Right, and then the final reason why we see this, so again, remember he's really describing the gender gap in offending. So why we think men commit so much more crime. So he says, well, yeah, a lot of it has to do with the leniency that women experience when interacting with law enforcement and the courts in terms of sentencing and in terms of arrest and charging, right? So for Pollock, right, this perceived gender gap in offending actually perpetuates women's ability to continue to mask their criminality, and the cycle continues. And here we are. Now, is this accurate? It's hard to say, right? This is open to interpretation, but it's certainly worth considering. Okay, so for Pollock again, right? Women have power. They have a lot more power than they a lot of times realize, and B, that others realize, and C, that they actually exercise. Okay, but by deceiving men, in particular men, but people in general, they are able to gain power. So he's talking about the idea of if a woman gets pulled over by a male police officer and turns on the tears, right? Or she tries to flirt with him. And so she exercises power. Now, this is a very dangerous concept, and I generally like to let y'all interpret these older type theories however you will, but it's really important to note here that what Pollock is essentially saying in not so many words here is that women's power lies in their sexuality or their ability to manipulate their sexuality. And that's a very dangerous concept because, women should be able to find power elsewhere. And what does that say about men's ability to use their sexuality and, right, the dynamic between men and women, right? So it's important to note that women can find power elsewhere. But for Pollock, right, 1950, this is old, this is how he saw it. So he saw really that the criminal justice system is biased because of preconceived ideas about women and their behaviors, right? And so he says gender roles make it so that women are treated more leniently. And this brings us to what we currently have as one of our two primary ways we explain how the criminal justice system responds to and handles female offenders. So you can think of it as a spectrum, okay? On one end, you have the evil woman hypothesis, and on the other, you have the chivalry hypothesis. So what we were just starting to describe there, what Pollock kind of laid the groundwork for, is a chivalry hypothesis. So this is where we see women being treated more leniently. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have the evil woman hypothesis, which is where women are treated more harshly than men. Okay, and we'll get into both of these here. So the chivalry hypothesis is used to explain why women are treated more leniently. Okay, so when we look at things like, for example, the likelihood to be released on your own recognizance, which I think might be in one of these slides as ROR. So if you see that, that's what that means, released on your own recognizance. And what that is if you are arrested and you are in jail and then you go to court, they will either give you bail, so you have to pay some money to get out, or they'll release you on your own recognizance, which means you sign a paper and you say, I will come back, and you will come back. Okay, men are much less likely than women to receive an ROR. Okay, so that's just one way we see this chivalry hypothesis play out, right? So the chivalry hypothesis also says that women's behaviors are kind of excused. So when they do act out or they do something bad, it's not even just like, oh, well, it's okay, we'll just give them more lenient. It's like, well, she was in a bad situation, or it's not that serious, she didn't hurt anybody, whereas men would not be receiving or wouldn't receive the same sort of reaction. Okay, so this is based on those assumptions that women are somehow too weak or too dumb or too dependent to commit serious crimes, and that they certainly are too weak and too small and fragile and gentle to commit violent crimes. Okay, and then also with that, this is also very much embedded in this notion that being the primary caregiver in the house, that they are preoccupied being a mother. They don't have time to worry about committing crime, and they certainly need to be able to get back to their family. So we'd be doing them a disservice to put them behind bars, because what are their children going to do without them? Okay, so this is one of those points that we consider so much more in the context of women, whereas we often neglect the fact that many men are fathers as well. And as a result of mass incarceration, there's entirely too many children out there that are without a father because he's behind bars. So again, this is the idea, right? This chivalry hypothesis says that female defendants who conform to traditional gender roles and are consistent with those expectations, those are the women that are going to get more leniency. So if you are a woman that runs very much counter to traditional gender roles, you're not going to receive the same sort of leniency. So let's say you're not married, you don't have any kids, you're the boss at your job, and you get arrested for some sort of crime. You're not going to get the same kind of leniency as if you were a stay-at-home mom, right? Because you don't need the same chivalrous treatment as women do, right? Because you're breaking all these other norms that are used to explain why we would treat you more leniently. Okay, but so what about those women that do contradict them altogether? How are they treated? Because it's not just that they're treated more leniently. There's more to it than that. Okay, so how we explain that? Sorry, there was a duplicate slide in there. That's what that just was. If you saw that, so how we treat these women that run counter to all of our gender expectations. Okay, this is the other end of the spectrum. This is that evil woman hypothesis. So this says women receive harsher treatment than men do in the system. And this is specifically because they're not only breaking the law and committing a crime, but they're violating gender norms. So we need to punish them for that as well. Okay, and that's not necessarily a conscious process that the courts go through. They're like, oh, well, we got to put her back in her gender place. But it is something that certainly biases all of us human beings that make up the criminal justice system. So these women, think a great example is Aileen Wuornos, since we've already talked about her a bit. Okay, she has been very much villainized because she is so counter to what we expect of women, right? She is a prostitute, she is a lesbian, she is violent, she is, not particularly attractive, she doesn't have any interest in having kids, she does drugs. All of these things are so against what we think women should be or what we expect women to be that, she was the first woman in Florida to receive the death penalty in, decades. So she was, and yes, she did commit murder. So I'm not saying that it's disproportionate, but compared to other women that have committed equally as egregious crimes, or at least close to, right? So I'm thinking about Jodi Arias, who murdered her boyfriend Travis Scott and like stabbed him countless times in the shower and took photographs. And I mean, it was a very horrible crime, and she was treated considerably more leniently, and she certainly was portrayed more so in the media as well. In the public eye, she was seen much more and presented much more gently than Aileen Wuornos ever was. Okay, and again, this comes back to what we expect from a person based on gender norms, right? So thinking about that, what other types of situations might this be the most prevalent? So it's when women are particularly unattractive, or when they are not trying to be attractive. So they might be a beautiful woman, but they might, not wear any makeup or dress or anything, right? And so they're sending a message, so to speak, that I don't care what you think. And that goes against gender norms, right? Women are supposed to care what people think about us and how they see us. This also is particularly salient when we see women committing crimes that go against gender norms. For example, filicide. So when we see a woman harm their own child, right, they're more likely to be treated more harshly than in a very similarly situated crime. Okay, now in the case we just talked, or in the podcast y'all listened to, Angela Giesbrecht, right? She was treated considerably differently, but that A was in Canada, and B is one example among a sea of many where we have seen women that are serving life sentences, okay, without the possibility of parole for such offenses. This is also particularly salient when whatever crime a woman commits benefits her in a powerful way. So, for example, let's say she committed a crime. This crime in particular that is especially male-dominated, right? Like white-collar crime. Let's say she embezzled a bunch of money. Okay, well now she's not only breaking gender norms, she's also breaking into men's realm, right? And assuming she's taking from men, and she's giving herself more power. And so we react with that by punishing her more harshly.